This is training footage from the 14th of January. I am training my shoulders and back, mostly focused on back, seeing as last week I trained focused on shoulders. I started the session with some shoulder mobility, getting ready for my first exercise, which was pull-ups. I'm going to try and explain why I chose the exercises I did and why I put them in a certain order. Now, I follow some rules of thumb when I'm structuring my sessions, where the hardest and more demanding exercises I'm going to start with, which is why I started with my pull-ups, which is the compound lift of the session. It's an upper body compound lift where my back, my arms, my core are all engaged. The idea behind this is you want to do those lifts first, so you're most fresh and you have no fatigue that could cause you to struggle with the exercise. This is why my first three exercises were pull-ups first, which is the hardest and most compound, followed by barbell row, which is also compound but is less core focused and more lower back focused, and then moving on to seated shoulder press, where my shoulders were still fresh even though I had done two compound lifts beforehand. Doing heavy lifts before your isolation work or accessory work also makes it easier to get to fatigue with the accessory work without having to use a heavy weight. The next three exercises I did were a lat pullover, a single arm row, and side raises. The lat pullover was more lat focused than either of the compound lifts and had less arm involvement because of its straight arm nature. After the lat pullovers, I went to single arm rows, which were used because of the greater range of motion than I could get with a barbell row, as I can focus one side at a time. I can add a slight rotation and get the bar higher or in line with my chest. I put the back exercises back to back in the isolation and compound lifts just to make the session harder, like you would for a superset pairing exercises straight after another. If you don't give your muscle group time to recover and then go into the next exercise, the intensity is going to be higher without having to move a heavier weight. When focused on strength, pairing exercises and supersets can be less efficient because you want to be moving as much weight as possible and getting a better stimulus for your central nervous system rather than causing the fatigue like you do for hypertrophy. The final exercise I did was a side raise, which is just going to focus the side delt more than the front delt, which was predominantly used in our seated shoulder press. Now I'm going to quickly go through the sets and reps for each exercise, starting with the pull-ups, where I was still kind of warming up, so I did one set of 5 and then 2 sets of 7, which is abysmal, but I haven't focused on my pull-ups much. I've been more focused on deadlifting when it comes to like back compound lifts, but I'm trying to work the pull-ups more. For my barbell row, I did sets of 10 roughly, depending on how I was feeling. Sometimes I went up to 12. I started with 40 kilos and then went to 50 for the final set. I was using a neutral grip bar just to make it as comfortable as possible with my wrists and trying to use as little momentum as possible. For the seated shoulder press, I was doing sets of 10 with my first set 15 kilos and then 3 sets at 20 kilos, which was a pretty high intensity, somewhere like 8 or 9 kind of RPE. And I really wanted to hit a high intensity because I only had 2 shoulder exercises in this workout. For the lat pullovers, I did 3 sets of 10 with a slight pause at the top, really squeezing into my lats, trying to get a peak kind of contraction because of the resistance curve of the band. Obviously, the further it travels, the harder it's going to be. I like doing this exercise after I've warmed up my back properly because it helps to get a better mind-muscle connection. I did 3 drop sets with the side raises, where I did about 10 reps with the 7 kilo weights and then 7 reps with the 5 kilo weights, taking each set to almost complete failure. Because I only did 2 shoulder exercises, I wanted both exercises to be very intense because the volume wasn't crazy high. And that was my session complete. It took just over an hour. It's a pretty solid session overall. You can definitely feel the intensity ramping up from last week, which I will carry on doing over the next couple of weeks. I can imagine myself following this training split for a couple of months. There's not much need to change it. I'll keep a decent variety of exercises with very similar themes behind the sessions.